There are forms of power that do not collapse because they are defeated, but because the world has evolved beyond them. They do not end in confrontation, nor do they disappear amid the noise of scandal or revenge. They end in silence when no one participates anymore, no one believes, and no one is willing to play the role they require in order to exist. The year 2026 is precisely such a moment. Not the year empathic people defeat narcissists, but the year narcissistic power becomes obsolete. For decades, even centuries, narcissists have survived through a very specific structure: the silence of victims, the lack of language to name manipulation, and a world in which appearances, status, and controlled narratives mattered more than truth. But that structure is cracking, not because narcissists have changed, but because the environment that sustained them has disappeared. When people begin to recognize patterns, when intuition is no longer dismissed as weakness, when silence no longer means submission, power built on manipulation loses the ground it stands on. What is unfolding is not a fleeting emotional movement, but a systemic psychological shift. While narcissists grow increasingly panicked as they lose control of the narrative, empathic individuals are quietly withdrawing from the game. They do not need to prove anything, seek revenge, or expose through force. Simply by no longer participating, the entire old power system begins to collapse from within. From Carl Jung's perspective, this is the moment when the persona is no longer sustained, and the shadow is forced back toward the subject where it cannot survive for long. This video is not meant to tell a story of who is right or wrong, nor to inflame collective anger. It is a map to help you understand why 2026 marks the end of narcissistic power, and at the same time opens a silent yet irreversible rise of empathic individuals, not as victims, but as people who have attained inner sovereignty. And to understand that, we must begin with the very structure that once allowed narcissism to dominate this world. Part 1. What is narcissistic power actually built on? To understand why narcissistic power is approaching its end, we must first dismantle a common misconception. Narcissists are not powerful because they are superior, but because they operate within an environment that allows manipulation to exist without being named. Their power does not come from inner strength, but from the dependency of others. It is a form of borrowed power, and anything that must be borrowed will, at some point, be reclaimed. Narcissists do not dominate through direct force. They dominate through gaps in awareness. They exist in blurred zones, where emotions are confused, where language is insufficient to accurately name what is happening, where people are taught to stay silent, endure, and doubt themselves. For a very long time, the world has unintentionally provided all the necessary conditions, valuing image over truth, status over depth, and confusing harmony with avoidance of confrontation. From a depth psychology perspective, narcissistic power operates as a mirror system. Narcissists do not generate intrinsic value. They require others to reflect back a sense of existence. Empaths, with their capacity to sense, understand, and regulate emotion, unwittingly become the perfect mirror. In the language of Carl Jung, narcissists live primarily within the persona, a social mask constructed to cover an inner emptiness. But the persona can only exist as long as someone believes in it. When the mirror withdraws, the mask does not collapse because it is attacked, but because there is no one left to support it. This is why narcissists are obsessed with controlling the narrative. Gaslighting is not a random power game, it is a survival mechanism. Triangulation is not cruelty for its own sake. It is a way to ensure that no one has a complete view of reality. Each person is allowed to see only a fragment, and within that fragmentation, the narcissist occupies the central role, the only one who knows everything. Their power lies in making people uncertain about what is real and what is their own fault. In families, This structure is maintained through secrecy and shame. In workplaces, through fear and covert competition. In society, through image and reputation. But wherever it appears, the structure is the same. One person controls reality by distorting the perception of those around them. Narcissists do not need you to believe they are good. They only need you to doubt yourself. And this is the crucial point. This kind of power cannot survive once people understand the pattern. The moment you see the cycle idealization, devaluation, manipulation, blame the game begins to lose its effect. Not because you fight back, but because you no longer react according to the script. Narcissists can handle anger, tears, pleading, even confrontation, but they are completely powerless in the face of clarity and withdrawal. For a long time, narcissistic power endured because empaths believed that if they were understanding enough, patient enough, compassionate enough, things would change. But 2026 marks the collective realization of a difficult truth. You cannot heal a structure that is built to avoid facing itself. And as this awareness spreads, narcissistic power begins to crack not from the outside, but from the very foundation of dependency on which it was built. In the next section, we will go deeper into the more important question. What is it about the modern world that has made this structure no longer functional? And why 2026 is not random, but an irreversible breaking point for the entire system of narcissistic power. Part 2. The global breaking point. When the world changes and human relationships can no longer remain the same. To understand why 2026 is not merely a personal psychological milestone, but a breaking point for relationships on a global scale, we need to look beyond the narrow narcissist empath narrative and place it within the context of a world that has undergone profound transformation in the years leading up to it. No psychological structure exists independently of its social environment. When the world shifts its axis, human relationships are forced to shift with it. The years preceding 2026 witnessed an unprecedented series of disruptions. Prolonged economic instability, declining trust in traditional systems, technology advancing faster than humans' capacity for emotional adaptation, and most importantly, collective exhaustion. People were not only worn down financially or professionally, but exhausted by the constant need to wear masks, endure, explain themselves, and please others. In that context, relationships built on manipulation, control, and emotional asymmetry began to feel intolerable. Pre-2026 society functioned under sustained baseline stress. When resources became scarce, time, energy, psychological safety, people began to choose more selectively. They no longer had the capacity to maintain relationships that required self-sacrifice in the name of keeping the peace. This is precisely where narcissistic power began to lose its ground, because such power only functions when others still have surplus energy to be drained. Another crucial social factor was the collapse of old relational norms. For decades, people were taught that families must endure, marriages must be preserved at all costs, toxic workplaces were normal, and silence equaled maturity. But leading up to 2026, these norms were collectively questioned. A new generation and older generations who were already depleted stopped asking, "How much more should I try?" and began asking, "Who am I becoming in this relationship?" That question marks the end of any structure built on manipulation. At the same time, the digital world and social media revealed a critical truth. Repetitive behavior can no longer hide for long. In personal relationships, people began comparing experiences, recognizing identical patterns, and understanding that what they once believed to be a personal problem was, in fact, a shared structure. When psychological isolation dissolves, narcissism loses its most powerful weapon, convincing the victim that they are alone and at fault. From the perspective of Carl Jung, This is the moment when the shadow is no longer contained by the collective. What was once pushed aside, repressed anger, unnamed wounds, avoided truths begins to surface en masse. And when the shadow rises at a societal level, relationships built on a false persona cannot hold. They must either transform or disintegrate. As 2026 arrives, all these trends converge. This is no longer a phase of merely recognizing the problem, but a phase that demands action. In romantic relationships, 2026 marks a wave of quiet yet decisive separations, not because love is absent, but because truth is. Empaths do not leave in anger. They leave because there is no longer any reason to remain in a structure that causes them to lose themselves. Within families, 2026 becomes the year of clear boundaries. No contact, low contact, and the refusal to continue playing the role of mediator for a system unwilling to change. In the workplace, it signals the breakdown of power dynamics rooted in fear and the rise of connections based on values and consistency. Any relationship that cannot withstand light dissolves silently. What matters is this: the shift carries no romantic sentiment. It is cold, clear, and non-negotiable. 2026 does not ask whether you are ready. It simply exposes the core question underlying every relationship. Is this connection built on truth, or does it exist only through one person's endurance? Once that question is raised, narcissism has no space left to evade. This is why 2026 becomes a year of sharp relational polarization. Relationships built on control escalate into conflict and then collapse. Relationships grounded in empathy and accountability grow deeper, though often quieter. Empaths are not seeking more connections, they are seeking the right ones. And it is precisely this selectivity that brings narcissistic power to its final limit. In the next section, we will move into a phase that many people feel most intensely, yet struggle to explain. Why just before and during 2026, the world appears louder, more extreme, and more chaotic, and why that chaos is not a sign of failure, but the final convulsion of a system that is slowly dying. Part 3. Extinction Burst. The final convulsion when power no longer works. When a system of power collapses, it rarely disappears quietly. Before it ends completely, it often enters a phase of violent escalation in which every behavior that once produced control is amplified to the extreme. In psychology, this phenomenon is called an extinction burst, and this is precisely the state narcissistic power enters as it approaches the threshold of 2026. What must be clearly understood is this: narcissists do not change when they lose power. They intensify old behaviors. When subtle manipulation no longer works, they do not self-reflect. When mild interference no longer destabilizes others, they do not stop. They turn up the volume louder, harsher, more extreme. Not because they are becoming stronger, but because they are panicking. In this phase, a recurring paradox becomes visible. Narcissists attack while simultaneously positioning themselves as victims. They accuse, blame, distort, while insisting that they are the ones who have been harmed. This is not a contradiction. It is a final survival strategy. When they can no longer control through authority, they attempt to control through emotion, especially through other people's guilt and fear. What makes this stage exhausting is that narcissists no longer target a single individual. They lash out broadly. They stir conflict, create factions, and force people to choose sides, because division is the only way to prolong the illusion of power. In a chaotic environment, truth struggles to stand, and that chaos becomes the last space in which narcissism can still breathe. Yet this very escalation exposes them. When every reaction is excessive, when every story is told with extreme intensity, when every disagreement is framed as an attack, what becomes visible is no longer that others are wrong, but an inner structure that cannot tolerate loss of control. An extinction burst does not persuade, it reveals. For empaths, this is the phase in which being pulled back is most likely. Not because they lack understanding, but because noise activates empathy. Narcissists know this. They hope that by amplifying suffering, by constructing urgent crises, they can pull empaths back into their old role, soothing, explaining, rescuing. But this is precisely where the boundary between the old and the new is drawn. What causes the extinction burst to fail is not resistance, but non-participation. When empaths stop explaining, stop reacting, stop trying to prove that they are right or good, every escalating behavior loses its target. Narcissists may shout louder, but no one is standing in front of them anymore. And in that empty space, truth does not need to be defended, it stands on its own. This phase also marks a crucial shift in relational dynamics. Conflict no longer creates connection. In the past, cycles of argument, reconciliation, and repetition kept toxic relationships alive. But when empaths reach a new level of awareness, conflict becomes only a signal to withdraw, not an invitation to stay. This leaves narcissists in psychological deadlock. Every familiar button stops working. So if the world before 2026 appears unusually loud, polarized, and tense, this is not a sign of regression. It is the expression of a system losing its ability to self-regulate. An extinction burst always looks like power is returning, but in reality, it is the final moment before that power disappears. In the next section, we will shift our focus away from narcissism to address what matters most. Why empaths do not need to win during this phase, and how conscious withdrawal becomes the foundation for an entirely new form of inner sovereignty after 2026. Part 4. Empath Rising. Not a new form of power, but a withdrawal from the power game. The most important clarification at this stage is this. Empaths do not rise by replacing narcissists on the same ladder of power. There is no Smena Vlasti, no winner versus loser in the old sense. The rise of the empath moves in an entirely different direction. They step out of the structure that once defined power itself. For many years, empaths were pulled into the role of emotional regulators for others. They were the ones who soothed, explained, and endured to keep everything stable. But at a certain point, and 2026 marks that threshold, they recognize a crucial truth. Artificial stability is no longer worth the cost of losing oneself. In that moment, narcissistic power loses the very subject it requires to exist. The empath's rise is not dramatic. It is not accompanied by grand declarations or performative actions. It begins with very small yet decisive choices. No more explanations, no more justifications, no remaining in conversations that have no capacity for transformation. This is not coldness, it is the maturation of awareness. When you understand that not everyone has the capacity for accountability, you stop expecting it, and that cessation of expectation is what frees you. At a deep psychological level, this is when empaths enter the process that Carl Jung called individuation, withdrawing energy from peripheral roles and returning it to the central self. Empaths no longer define themselves by being needed, recognized, or forgiven. They begin to live from inner strength rather than from others' reactions. And when this occurs on a collective scale, it produces a shift to which narcissism cannot adapt. One clear sign of this rise is the ability to recognize without confronting. Empaths are no longer drawn into proving who is wrong. They see patterns early in language, emotional rhythm, and the avoidance of responsibility and withdraw before harm repeats itself. What once caused them pain becomes an advantage. Intuition sharpened by experience, no longer silenced by blind hope. More importantly, empaths do not seek to defeat narcissists. They become irrelevant. And in psychological terms, Nothing is more threatening to a structure that survives on reflection than losing its central role. When empaths no longer react, no longer revolve, no longer serve as regulators, every controlling behavior becomes superfluous. Power is not taken away, it is left behind. After 2026, we begin to see a new kind of connection form. Fewer in number, slower in pace, but deeper and more real. Empaths no longer seek relationships to fill a void, but to resonate. Connections are no longer built on the fear of loss, but on voluntary presence. This reshapes the entire relational ecosystem, from love and family to collaboration and community. This rise also carries a paradox. Empaths speak less, yet stand more firmly. They do not need to convince the world that they are right. They build lives in which truth is expressed through how they live. And in an age of constant noise and disruption, that quiet consistency becomes an anchor for others who are searching for a way out of chaos. The next section brings us to the final synthesis. Two diverging paths after 2026. On one side, the inevitable contraction of narcissistic power. On the other, a new way of living that empaths are quietly creating, not through resistance, but through inner sovereignty. Part 5. Two paths after 2026. An irreversible divergence. After 2026, what matters is no longer who is right or who is wrong, but who is able to continue evolving in a new world. This is the moment when paths fully separate, not through declarations, but through lived reality. What once coexisted in ambiguity can no longer occupy the same psychological space. On one side is the gradual contraction of narcissistic power. On the other, the slow but steady expansion of the empath. For narcissists, the world after 2026 does not collapse overnight, it contracts. Each time a tactic stops working, another piece of ground is lost, not because others oppose them, but because no one remains to regulate the consequences for them. Relationships are no longer patched up, conflicts are no longer resolved on their behalf, and each small, unbuffered failure accumulates into a sense of being surrounded. In this state, narcissists do not learn, they repeat. This repetition creates a closed loop. The same stories, the same blame, the same victim narratives, but with fewer and fewer people listening. Their social space shrinks into homogeneous circles where everyone reflects the same insecurity. With no counterbalance, no depth, and no truth to anchor to, power becomes an echo in an empty room. And within that echo, bitterness grows instead of wisdom. By contrast, the empath's path after 2026 is quiet, yet expansive in depth. Freed from dispersing energy to manage chaos, empaths begin rebuilding life from very basic foundations. A slower rhythm, clearer boundaries, and carefully chosen relationships. Not to avoid pain, but to avoid recreating the conditions for pain. A crucial shift occurs here. Empaths stop seeking external validation. They no longer need to be understood by those who lack the capacity to understand. They no longer need recognition from structures that do not respect truth. This creates a form of freedom inaccessible to narcissism, freedom from the need to prove one's existence. And as this freedom becomes widespread, it reshapes how people connect with one another. In relationships formed after 2026, a new criterion emerges: the capacity for emotional responsibility. Connections no longer revolve around intensity, drama, or grand promises, but around consistency and presence. Empaths are no longer drawn to powerful relationships, but to safe ones. This shift renders many old structures incompatible, not because they are bad, but because they are no longer synchronized with a new nervous system. At a deeper level, this is the very divergence that Carl Jung described in different terms. One path belongs to an ego that refuses to face itself and retreats into defense. The other belongs to the individual, who accepts integration of experience and continues the process of individuation. These two paths do not intersect, because they are grounded in opposing principles of living, control and consciousness. After 2026, these paths move ever farther apart. Narcissism may still exist, still be loud, still create disturbance, but it no longer shapes the norm. Meanwhile, empaths may appear less visible on the surface, yet become the invisible pillars of new systems, healthier families, more sustainable collaboration, and communities grounded in values rather than fear. The final section will close this entire journey with a question not addressed to narcissism, but to you. Where will you stand in the world after 2026, continuing to participate in obsolete games, or stepping into an era of inner sovereignty and authentic living? Part 6. The Era of Inner Sovereignty. You do not need to win, only to awaken. Looking back at the entire landscape from before 2026 to after 2026, one thing must be made clear. This is not a story about narcissists, but a story about the maturation of human consciousness. Narcissism is merely the most visible symptom of an old system, one in which power was built on fear, silence, and disconnection from the self. When that system dissolves, what remains is not victory, but the responsibility to live truthfully. The world after 2026 does not reward those who are the loudest, nor does it favor those who are most skilled at manipulation. It demands an entirely different capacity, the ability to stand on one's own without needing to control others. This is where many people misunderstand. They believe empaths are chosen, protected, or favored by the universe. The truth is far colder. Empaths rise because they have already paid the full cost of not seeing the truth, and they are no longer willing to pay it again. At the deepest level, this is the moment Carl Jung described as the shift from living through the persona to living through the self. The persona needs an audience, needs a role, needs reaction. The self does not. The self exists even when no one is watching, no one is recognizing, no one is applauding. And in a world where external structures are collapsing, only those who live from the self are not swept away. Most conflicts after 2026 do not arise from differences in opinion, but from the collision of two levels of consciousness. One side continues trying to pull others back into the old game, blaming, controlling, emotionally manipulating. The other side is simply no longer there. No resistance, no explanations, no escape, just withdrawal from the loop. And that withdrawal itself becomes the final answer. What matters most is this: you are not required to become perfect, nor are you meant to become anyone's healer. The world after 2026 does not need more saviors. It needs individuals who take responsibility for their own inner lives. When each person stops handing their emotions over to be managed by others, power built on manipulation naturally loses all ground on which it once stood. When all the noise settles, what remains is not the story of the narcissist, but who you have become after no longer participating in the illusion. 2026 does not mark the collapse of an individual. It marks the end of a way of operating power that was built on silence, fear, and one-sided sacrifice. No one is overthrown, no one is punished. The world simply no longer provides the conditions for the old structure to continue existing. Within that picture, the empath does not step onto the stage to take another role. They step off the stage entirely. They do not need to prove they are right, nor do they need to demand justice from structures that never functioned on truth in the first place. What they do, and the only thing that needs to be done, is to withdraw their energy inward and build a life in which peace no longer depends on the reactions of others. Through the lens of Carl Jung, this is the moment of shifting from living through the persona to living through the self. No longer needing an audience, no longer needing a role, no longer needing an opposing figure to confirm one's existence. When a person reaches this state, all manipulative power naturally loses its effect, not because it is defeated, but because it has nowhere left to attach. If there is one final reminder for this phase, it is not a call to fight, but an invitation to remain with yourself. Do not turn back because of the last noises of dying systems. Do not mistake chaos for truth. And do not measure your growth by whether others are still trying to pull you back into old games. You are not responsible for saving a world that has chosen not to look back. Your only responsibility is to live in alignment with the level of consciousness you have reached. When enough people do that, no declarations are needed, no movements, no leaders. A new order forms on its own. 2026 is not the end of pain. It is the end of you carrying pain on behalf of others. And from that moment onward, freedom is no longer something you seek. It becomes the natural state of a soul that has returned to itself.